Joining me now to talk more about voting and efforts being taken to protect the democratic process is investigative journalist Greg Palast. So, Greg, I appreciate you coming on the program tonight. And this is something we've talked about a lot, even when it comes to a big anticipated election, such as the upcoming one, or even the 2016 one, for example. Voter turnout is always an issue. It's something where less than half the country really participates in the election. So I want to ask you, why is that?
We make it so darn difficult to vote. We have crazy rules to register. Millions of people each year are knocked off the voter rolls and are surprised to find out that they can't vote. We have ID requirements in some states. Every state and many counties are completely different. So it's confusing, mishmash, just all these crazy rules for voting. And then just difficulty, like, for example, early voting in Ohio, only one early polling station per county. So you've got one station in Cleveland, one in Dayton. Massive line. So we kind of make it painful to vote in America. And so a lot of people do it.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but sometimes when it happens on this argument, I often hear, well, if someone isn't, for example, going to get a license or an ID that has their picture on it, or the ability to bring in their mail and verify that they are at this certain address or whatever it may be, why should they be voting in the upcoming election? So what's your response to those type of allegations?
Well, if you think Americans are basically criminal, and that we have a bunch of illegal voters, and yeah, we need all these rules. But of course, we don't have that. That's why we don't wear all ankle bracelets or have chips in our head like in Terminator. Most Americans aren't criminals. We don't have double voters. We don't need all these IDs. Imagine if you don't have a car and you have to get an ID from a DMV to vote, and you have to have papers to get you have to have ID to get ID. It's just like, so we just make it so crazy difficult. My wife's from Switzerland. Everyone votes. No one registers. There's no problems. They got, by the way, a much bigger immigrant population than we do. We just make it crazy difficult.
And sometimes this issue is politicized. I mean, we hear people on the right, for example, sometimes bring up the idea that there's ballot harvesting and voter fraud, things of that nature. And then those on the left, for example, will say, well, there should be no limits whatsoever. I mean, there shouldn't be voter ID laws, there shouldn't be whatever. But you've brought up the point before that oftentimes Republicans are left off of voter rolls as well. It's not just necessarily a Democrat versus Republican thing as well. It happens to all Americans for that matter. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I put up these lists of purge voters. You can look yourself up at SaveMyVote2020.org. And I hope you go if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you're green, blue, or purple. Please check your registration right now because, hey, you may be wiped off the voter rolls and you don't know it.
And when we talk about the idea of getting people registered to vote, for example, I mean, is there a reason why when someone turns 18 that they're not just automatically enrolled, for example, or that they do have to go through a process in order to make sure that they're verified? And I mean, they have to go and renew their ability to vote every now and then, because as you said, sometimes people are purged off of rolls. Is there a reason why there isn't perhaps maybe automatic registration for verified American citizens, maybe using a social security number or something that could be deemed safer?
Well, we have Oregon. You're automatically enrolled as a voter in Oregon unless you say don't register me as a voter when you graduate from a school or you get a license or have any contact with the government. You're automatically registered when you move in. South Dakota has no registration, and I don't see a bunch of mooses coming in from Canada to vote. So I think we just add all these obstacles, and it gets highly politicized. Let's just let let's let American citizens vote. We don't have a big fraud problem. But we do have a problem with making it difficult to vote. So let's just let everyone vote. We're not going to have a massive fraud problem. We'll have a better democracy.
And there's a campaign as of recently coming out in order to try to inspire people to do just that. And I do know that we have a soundbite that we want to show of this PSA, kind of getting people out there to vote. And the person who most notably tweeted it out recently was actor Leonardo DiCaprio. So I do want to play that PSA really quickly and then get your comments on it. Let's take a look.
In 2016, the president was elected by a tiny number of voters, 77,744 votes in 3 states, about the same as a Beyoncé concert. What you didn't know was that 1,800,000 voters disappeared. Their voter registrations were canceled and their voices silenced.
And today to come out and not be able to vote and no one can give you an explanation, like, it's extremely emotional and it bothers me It bothers me to my core.
Investigative journalist Greg Palast discovered that their votes were intentionally suppressed.
Mr. Kemp, are you removing black voters from the voter rolls?
Young voters and people of color are the targets of this big purge of voters. The good news is that this year we have the names of the people that are at risk of having their votes stolen. SaveMyVote2020.org.
So we talk about, for example, how people being purged off ballots is a bipartisan thing. It happens to Democrats and Republicans. But then I was looking at that PSA, and I mean, it very clearly is partisan. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, is right there, President Trump with lightning in the background, and they're talking about people being purged off ballots. Do you fear, for example, that perhaps the partisan nature of a PSA like that prohibits this whole movement, getting people voted in general, registered in general, is perhaps hurt by efforts like that?
Well, two things. Number one, that is aimed towards the general election and to African American voters who've been we have to be honest about it, who've been the number one target of purges, mass purges of the voter rolls, according to just the cold numbers. Now, if you go to gregpalast.com, you get to see not only the bad boys who are removing voters like Brian Kemp, who's a Republican of Georgia, but Democratic Secretary of State Alex Padilla, who's probably the vote purging general, the purging champ. So, I have to go after Democrats. I have to go after Republicans. I go after them all. And I'm warning you, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or otherwise, please check your registration.
That is good to hear, because I do want to hear people being held to account no matter what it is, and especially when it comes to something such as the average American having the opportunity to just participate in our democratic republic. It's something that is so important. I mean, we talk about it on the show all the time, where I want to make sure that our elected leaders are looking out for our interest, whether it's making sure that trade imbalances are looked after, whether people are being taken care of economically or even civically, but especially when it comes to partaking in our democracy in general. So once again, for people who want to find out if they are registered to vote, if they've been purged or anything like that, can you give them a resource to make sure that they can make sure that they are able to vote in this upcoming election?
Go to SaveMyVote2020.org. And it will tell you if you've been removed from voter rolls in several states. If so, there's a link to re-register. And that's what I want you to do. Please check people don't understand. Millions of people are going to find themselves out of luck that they can't vote because they've been removed from the voter rolls. And again, everyone, whatever your party, please check your registration right now and re-register immediately. And in a couple states like Wisconsin and California, you can actually register right on election day.
And that's good to know, because I know that in some states right now, people are already voting. So some people are going to get that little bit of a heads up maybe and find out if they're already purged or something, and then have the opportunity to then go in person on election day itself. But it does raise another interesting point, and it's the idea that a lot of media networks are saying that we may not know the winner on November 3rd, for example, because there's going to be a surplus of mail-in voting, numbers that we haven't seen ever, for that matter. So it may not necessarily be whoever has the most votes on election day will be the winner, but as the results start trickling in after that from the mail-in voting, do you think that will be the case this year?
Absolutely. We won't have an idea who's won for a good 2 weeks. When you have to understand that we're going to have to go through a giant process of opening tons of mail-in ballots. There's going to be fights over which ballots should be counted. I would recommend to people, if you really want to be safe with your vote, don't just pick a candidate and lick a stamp and put it on. I would really recommend that you vote early. Almost every state has early voting. You can do it safely. There's not giant long lines in most cases. And that's a safer way to vote, because I think we're going to just be inundated with mail-in votes, and it's going to cause a huge problem. And, if your vote is not counted by what's called the certification date, it won't count. And so I want you to protect your vote. I don't care what your party is. Please, if you can safely, with a mask, gloves, whatever you need, vote early.
I think that's very well said, because looking at the polls right now in some of these states, it's going to come down to a couple 10,000 in a few select states: Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, things like that. So for everybody watching, know that your vote very much so does matter this upcoming election cycle, perhaps more so than it has in the past. But Greg Palast, I really appreciate you coming on the program tonight, breaking down this issue and addressing some of the concerns that people may have about voting going into November. Thank you very much.
Save your vote. Thank you very much.